Hello, and welcome to the Human-ish podcast. The Human-ish podcast aims to explore what makes us human and the human experience. All of our lives exist within the realm of experience. Anything that matters eventually boils down to experience. Therefore, in the quest to understand what makes us human, we have to explore a wide array of topics with the intent that we eventually understand ourselves. Today's guest is Tim Rouse. Tim is a professional storyteller and works as a public sector consultant where he connects academics to non-specialists via storytelling. In this podcast, we will discuss the role of stories in culture, the construction of stories, and how we may come to a greater appreciation of our stories, and much more. So I hope you enjoy episode 5 of the Human-ish podcast, The Power of Storytelling. We are recording. How's it going, Tim?
It is going pretty well, Danae. How are you doing?
Not bad at all. So I was talking to my friend the other day, and he asked me, who have you got on the podcast next? And I said, a professional storyteller. And his instant reaction was, that's the coolest job title I've ever heard.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad of that.
So what's the normal reaction when you tell someone your profession?
I mean, obviously we hope for it to be that reaction, but I think the reality is that most people they don't understand what that means. And so maybe they think, oh, is this someone who reads books to children, or what is, and I think it's confused. And we were sort of vaguely talking about this a moment ago. It's confused by the fact that there is a bit of a fashion right now for everyone to claim to be a storyteller, right? Like if you're an author, oh, they're a brilliant storyteller. Or if you're like, you give me the example of a chef, I'm a storyteller with my food. This is the cheese that my grandmother used to. So there's this kind of confusion or this dilution around what the word storyteller might mean. And so I guess I'm really lucky, and I'll talk a little bit about how I got into storytelling because it's relevant here. As a small child, my parents took me to a lot of folk festivals, kind of traditional British music, singing, dancing, and there were often storytellers there, either from British traditions or from brought in from around the world. So I grew up with this awareness that there were people whose job it was to know hundreds and hundreds of different stories and just tell them, and that was entertaining, and I would sit and listen for hours to the storytellers, and then on the car journeys home, I would tell back all of the stories that I'd heard.
That's cool.
Over the course of the weekend. And in a way, there are still stories now that I tell, which I know I first heard or I learned in those experiences. Yeah, but it meant that I grew up with this idea that, okay, that is, as you're a child and you have this kind of very limited perspective on what you can be when you grow up. You can be like a school teacher or a fire person, or but storyteller was one of them, alongside astronaut and everything else. Storyteller.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So that's it. And I guess that's the core of what I do as a professional storyteller is, my job is to know or to be able to research and to adapt and work on stories and then be able to tell them as one person, semi-unscripted, in the moment, tell the tale to whoever's listening. And then there are, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in a bit, fringe areas that moves into.
So then how does that compare to, let's say, an author, right? So how does an author telling a story differ to somebody telling a story in person as you do?
Yeah, what a great distinction to make. I think the first thing, and I have massive respect for authors because it's such a solitary practice, right? If you sit down and you think, oh, I've got an idea for a book, I shall rattle off, and maybe it takes you, maybe you're quick and it takes you a year to do your first draft, and you might leave it to one side, or you send it to your editor, and it might be another 3 or so years, and this is if everything goes really smoothly, 3 or so years before it gets to publication. It goes out, maybe you're really successful, thousands of people read it. Of those thousands of people, a few might talk about it to someone they know. Very few will come back to you. So you have to, I guess that authors have to be really robust in themselves, because it's they're giving all of that time out And where does the feedback come from?
Mm.
Whereas when I tell, because when I'm telling, it's in the moment, right? It's to an audience, live audience. We're sharing the same air with one another. There's a lot of in the moment feedback that happens. And I'm not just talking, I mean, sometimes they might be quite crude, like there might be tricks of getting the audience to join in or something, but a lot of it might just be, I'll make eye contact with someone and just get a sense of how this story is landing with them right now, and then change what I'm saying, what I'm doing based on that relationship. So I think that's the first thing. It's very immediate, the storytelling that I do. I guess the second thing is the material. I predominantly work with traditional material, folk tales, myths, legends, fairy stories. So whilst they're all kind of my own takes, my own versions of those stories, at their core, they are sort of anonymous, historic, some of them ancient texts, rather than most authors today will be a little bit more original, more entirely original in their composition. And maybe the third thing is scale. I guess a short story writer is a bit different. I mean, there's loads of differences. There's something really interesting. One of the things that I have with when I'm working, if I'm teaching people who are more used to writing to kind of tell their stories, one of the things I run into a lot is detail. Because like if you're writing a story down, the instinct is to include lots of detail. You need to put a lot of detail because all you've got is your text, your words.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're telling, you've got the tone of your voice, volumes, the speed, your body language, all of that. So, far less needs to be said in terms of in terms of the actual word choice, because there's so much extra information.
The immediacy of the immediacy thing strikes me. So we talked like a while back about like logos, mythos, and eros. I'll let you explain that. But then, what it seems to me, based on what you just said, is that the distinction within storytelling, like you from the spoken word, you have more of that eros, like sort of component, right? Because you're appealing to the emotion of the audience. You don't have to go into as much detail because you're in a sense embodying your story, right? Whereas a writer has more space to, put down the philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. And they kind of have to put down, like I've looked at transcripts of stories, or I've written transcripts of stories that I've told, and it feels very dead and very limited, because I'm doing so much else at the same time. Likewise, I'm not criticizing people who read aloud, people who listen to audiobooks. I think that's great. But if I stood in front of a live audience and spoke for an hour with what would work as text, I don't think it would go down as well. So yeah, there is something really important about it being embodied. And speech is magical, speech is magical like that, right? Because if your body feels it, like the primal act of speech, forget language, the primal act of making a sound, whether it's a person talking or a bird crying out in a tree, it's like an emotion in the body becomes this expression. We shake the air molecules. The shaking in those air molecules is received by someone else's body, and now our bodies are kind of vibrating together. I'm not talking in kind of a mystical sense. I'm talking in a really kind of like pure biophysics sense. So this thing in me has touched and has created a thing in you over a distance. So maybe I should talk about that eros, mythos, and logos thing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I did want to say on that though is like a primary function of the brain, like from a neuroscientific perspective, is movement, right? Like everything comes around movement. Every interaction with another human being is to do with movement, right? And I mean, you can get mystical and say, well, in a sense, you're an extension of me, and and vice versa, right? And that speaks to like the potency of storytelling or experiencing something, right? If you were telling a story and I'd actually experienced that story, right, which is very unlikely since most stories are fictional, that would be, like, I would have learned the lessons, right? I experienced that. That's more potent than somebody telling me the story about it. But the next best thing you get is telling or reading a story about the thing. It's telling more so because you see the emotion that the story should be, I say should loosely, should be enumerating, right? And that's way more potent than, let's say, just reading a story, or let's say just hearing it on an audiobook, because there's movement involved.
Yeah, and I think, and you're sort of getting at that here, but I think one of the big jobs that stories do, one of the things they do for us, and this, and I want to expand this also applies to the written stories, films, books, whatever, plays, is that they give us that safe space to feel emotions without actually having to to go through them ourselves. So, if we read a story about heartbreak or rejection, hopefully when we ourselves feel heartbreak or rejection, we recognize those things and we don't think, oh my gosh, I'm going to die, or we don't freak out and thump someone because we don't, what is this anger that I'm feeling? Oh wait, hang on, I know this. I've encountered this in these characters in this fictional space. There was a lovely piece of research about how kids whose parents had embarrassed them, like kids who said their parents were quite embarrassing when they were teenagers, were usually better at dealing with embarrassment when they were older, right? Like,
that's crazy. Okay.
They didn't like have such a pronounced blush or stutter so much if they got him. And it's like, yeah, of course, because you practice having those emotions in safe, small doses. And then you know them and you know what's going on in your body a bit more, and the brain is used to that reaction a little bit more. So
all dads now have a license to tell bad jokes.
Yeah, I mean, I regret saying that, but
let's get on to this like logos, mythos, eros distinction then.
Yeah, I love this distinction. This is a distinction which I don't know where this distinction comes from. Obviously, those terms are Greek, but I was introduced to it by a Jewish storyteller and priestess called Rachel Rose Reed. And she was saying there's three ways of knowing. There's three kinds of knowledge. Logos, which is sort of a rational knowing, a reasoned inquiry, a thinking things through kind of abstract, perhaps, way of knowing. And there is eros, which is the knowing that comes with experience, with feeling, with sensation. And then there's mythos, which is the knowing that comes from stories, narrative knowing. So if we to ask a question like, what does it mean to be in love? Then logos might say, this is what's happening in your body chemistry when you are feeling those feelings. This is what love is doing to your brain. This is maybe the social function of love. This is how love relates to peer bonding between people. Eros, what is it like to fall in love? Eros says, go and fall in love. Like, you'll know what love is when you've done it a few times. Then you will understand love. And mythos says, let me tell you some stories about lovers from the past. So let me tell you, what you learn, your Romeos and Juliets or whatever, and you go, okay, these are some love stories, or your paperback romance novels, whatever. And from that, we get an understanding of what love is and what our expectations might be for those things. And I mean, I'm not saying that any of those three ways of knowing is better than the other. Clearly, they're all really important. I sort of feel like maybe culturally we've labeled logos as being very important at the moment. It's like, yeah, what's most credible is, and there's probably some good reasons for that. So they're all important, and they're not always distinct, right? Like sometimes, reasoning things through, thinking these through might create a bodily sensation. So it's like we're drifting between the two anyway. And I think the other thing that I really want to say on these is that they are all happening all the time, right? Like, so sometimes we've got really strong stories about what the world is like that we don't realize are our stories about what the world is like.
Such as?
Okay, so I'll give a not controversial example.
Okay.
To begin with, right? I am quite an optimistic person. I have a story in me that the world is probably going to work out okay. That's not logical. Right? That's not. But that is part of how I relate to the world. My wife, who grew up in quite an impoverished setting in rural Pennsylvania in the States, living with her grandparents and her parents as well. You know, and yeah, and she was Baha'i, and it was not a good part of the world to be. It's not as bad as in some parts of the world to be Baha'i, but like basically Baha'i, you might as well have been worshipping the devil for how the local people.
What is Baha'i?
Oh, so the Baha'is are, it's a relatively recent religion with its own cycle of prophets and revelations from, I think, the 17 or 1800s that it sparked off.
So
It's
is it
a
like,
modern.
so is it
I was
like
gonna say-
Mormonism, or I haven't heard of it before.
Yeah, sure. So it's not massively well known. It grew out of Middle Eastern culture. So sometimes in the West, people go, "Oh, like it's an offshoot of Islam," and it's like,
Hmm.
yeah, it's an offshoot of Islam. Like Islam is an offshoot of Judaism, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
they kind of came from the same place, and they're founded on. But yeah, so and in the Baha'i teachings, there's a big sequence of prophets, of whom Krishna is one of them, Christ is one of them, Zoroaster is one of them, and they hold
Okay.
that each person brings their own cycle of revelation. She has stepped away from that faith, but that was the faith that she was raised in, her family was raised in, and it was a bit of a barrier to them getting on with their neighbors.
Yeah, I can
because
imagine.
the
Yeah,
neighbors
yeah.
were a little bit more a little bit more conservative in their outlook. We'll just say that. Anyway, the point I'm making is that she is far more anxious about the world. She has internalized a story of the world that says, no, things are not going to work out unless I make them work out. And there's nothing particularly logical about that either necessarily, right? But those are both stories about the world that we hold that we might not realize were stories.
Hmm. So, when I was at university, I did a module called neuroaesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
So the premise behind this module, one of the premises behind this module was that artists are in a sense scientists, right? And in a sense, like visual neuroscientists, they come up with conclusions to do with the way we perceive the world, right? For example, Mondrian, his basic premise was that the fundamental component of vision or what we see are like straight lines, right? And then the composition is a different story. But that was one of his claims, or maybe underlying claims, right? And then when we look at the brain, one of the ways, the way the vision is constructed, one of our fundamental, like, we have orientation selective cells, which means they fire in response to visual inputs that are like of certain angles. Okay, so we have that, and then what I'm seeing here is storytellers are sort of like neuroaestheticians. I'm not going to come up with a name so far, but as in, without knowing it, maybe you're tapping into like psychology, right? So this idea that we have, like, we see the world as a story is actually goes quite deep, right? Because we, for example, I've got a boxing bag in my room, right? Now I'm not seeing something that's filled with sand and clothes and is black and made of leather and hung up with chains. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing something I can hit, right? And then when I'm seeing something I can hit, I'm seeing my entire story of martial arts in a way, right? And then the story I've told myself about my growth as a martial artist. Yeah, so I think that goes quite deep, and that's very, like, that gives stories a lot more power if you realize that people automatically see things as stories. So then authors and storytellers like yourself, like, are tapping into that sort of the deepest form of like perception.
Yeah, and so important for things like persuasion and engagement and so forth. Like, because as you say, that all of these artistic practices are rooted in the brain, in who we are, right? So they can kind of bypass sometimes the defenses that we might have constructed. Yeah, and there's something, I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but I'm really interested to hear that. Like, it's a lovely example. I see the beanbag, and it's part of the story of who I am to look at that punching bag and think about everything that brings up for me. So whether that's I want to hit it, or gosh, I should have been doing more training lately and there's some guilt there, or whatever.
It's like both, right? It's everything, I think the more sort of, again, everything's coming back to this mystical idea that, like, there's I don't exist. I'm like, just everything exists at the same time. Like, you could tell a story about yourself based on everything you see in a way. Right? Yeah, because like, to perceive something means to perceive something in relation to yourself. And then I suppose that actually, this is quite nice, gets onto the subjectivity of stories, because whenever you tell a story, someone's going to see it with relation to themselves. So
Yeah, of course. So, you know, I tell a story, anyone tells a story, every person that's listening is imagining something slightly different and may have a totally different takeaway from that story. There will be common themes, and there will be maybe certain emotions that are shared, but they will all take away something different. And also, I think it's funny you mentioned this word subjectivity, because I sort of feel like with a story, we give ourselves permission for subjectivity. And like almost everything is, we live in a world of subjective experience, but it's like, because in the story we have permission for that subjectivity, we can be a little bit more open. You know, the things that are most likely to change our minds are the stories or the direct personal experiences, because those are where we can go, oh, all right, you know, facts, as we know at the moment, facts do not do a good job of changing people's minds.
Yeah, that's true. That is very true.
Yeah. Whereas,
So that, this comes back to you then, right? So you talk to academics a lot, right? Help them communicate their research.
Go on. Sorry, it's Zoom. We're talking over each other.
Okay.
One of the things that I do that is really rewarding, and it's work that I've been doing for maybe the last 8 years, has been to get with early careers researchers or PhD students, academics, and help them talk about their research to non-specialists by telling stories. And in a way, I got into it completely accidentally. Some people at the University of Sheffield's Arts and Humanities and Public Engagement. I mean, I think they must have just Googled Sheffield storyteller and my website came up, because I don't think they knew me or my work particularly.
Yeah.
They got in touch, and so this was the question: do the same skills that I use when I, like, I don't know, find some 600-year-old story and go, oh, how would I adapt that? How would I make that work as a performance? How do those same skills work when an academic or a researcher is trying to talk about their research to an audience of non-specialists, an audience of the general public? And the answer is, it turns out, thank goodness, or I wouldn't still be doing 8 years on, yeah, it works really, really well. And I think the core of why it works, I'll talk about the core of why it works, and I'll talk about the core of why it's such satisfying work for me. The core of why it works is that actually storytelling is something that we all do all of the time. Like, it's our most natural way of speaking about the world. How are you doing? Terrible, because this happened and then this happened and this person did this and that's awful and now I feel like this, boom. Or, you know, did you see the news today? This is what these people have been up to, right? Like, or even, you know, when we share back, we go through memories of times that we've had together. It all takes the form of, here are some events in time, little causal relationships between them, the building blocks of story. And we do that in a, as I say, in a very kind of natural, intuitive way. And then what academia does is it sort of says, get rid of all of that. There are very particular ways of talking, and you have to cite all your sources, and you have to, you know, cover all the bases and the counter arguments and consider all the different points of view. And so it encourages people to really be at the coalface, down in either up in the ivory tower. Let's mix some metaphors: up in the ivory tower or down in the mines at the coalface. But it's a very up close way of working. Whereas if I can sit with people and sort of get them to take a step back and reconnect with what it is that excites them about their work, and free them from this sense that there is like a right or a wrong way of talking, then suddenly they become far more engaging. I'll maybe give an example story about that in a moment. But this is such a rewarding work. That's what I was going to say, because like nobody goes through doing a PhD or working in research fields unless they really know what they're doing, like unless they're pretty brilliant, and unless they really care about it, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
spend 3-5 years working on a PhD if on some level what you're doing doesn't get you out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you can forget that along the way.
Yeah.
But,
It can hurt, but yeah, like
yeah, absolutely.
automatic. So then you must be learning loads then.
Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing. And yeah, like I say, it's great. And a lot of the time it's because I don't know who I'm going to get in the room,
Yeah.
right? Like earlier on this year, I tell you what, I'll give the example that I usually give for how satisfying this work can be. There was a woman called Ada that I was working with from the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health at the University of Sheffield. I did a lot of work up in Sheffield there. And, you know, we came into a rehearsal session. They were meant to bring their stories, and she turned up late and her head was kind of slumped. And she sat at the back. And then when everyone else had kind of shared, it was her turn, and she pulled out her device and she started talking about the comparative analysis between two different forms of healthcare and its implication. And after about like 30 seconds, she dried up. And I was sitting there, and I will admit, I was sitting there thinking, this person is totally unsuited to doing storytelling work. How can I get them off this project? But it's not my job to say. It's my job to say, gosh, that's why don't you just tell me a little bit about what's going on for you? And she said, oh, I'm sorry, I hate my research at the moment. Okay, what got you into it? She says, well, I used to be a nurse, but I'm not very good at people telling me what to do. And so suddenly it's like, okay, now I see you as a person. This is a bit more exciting. Keep going. So she's talking about not wanting to be a nurse anymore, thought she could get into research. She went to see in Nigeria, she went to see like quite an important public health person. She was sitting in the office, loads of certificates on the wall. And then halfway through this interview where this person is telling her all of the things that she should study, someone comes in like cut off shorts and a shirt with their hands out like this, saying, please, please, please. And this public health bounces up from behind the desk and says, do you have your, and I think the figure is like 50,000 naira or something. I can't remember what it is in the local currency. And the person doesn't, and the health official chases them out. And it turns out that what he was asking for was fertility treatment.
Oh.
Because as Ada explains, Nigeria has actually got a pretty good, pretty developed public health system, so national social medicine system, but it doesn't cover fertility treatment. It's a big deal culturally. So what happens, because it's so expensive, what happens is that people's families chip in, or their churches chip in. So the whole community, and in some ways this is positive, in some ways, the whole community is now feeling invested in this baby that might happen, but also what an enormous amount of pressure to put those people under in what is already likely to be a very emotional, very difficult time in their lives, right? So what Ada was researching wasn't even different fertility treatments. It was just the mental health aspects that went alongside different countries in the way they provided fertility treatments. And the reason why she hated her research is because at that point, her job was turning up to work every morning and writing down the transcripts of all these interviews, with most of which were with couples who were going through some really difficult things.
Yeah, that's horrible.
Financially. So, but the important thing was, this is the point that I love to make with this story. One, when she actually started talking, she was so interesting to listen to. Like, wow, she was good to listen to. And two, at the end of the session, she left with head held high and a spring in her step that just hadn't been there.
Wow. Because
that act of talking about it, of sharing the story, had reconnected her to why she was doing it, to her passion.
Yeah.
And look, that was a load of stuff that I had not thought about before. So when you say you must learn loads of interesting things, it's like, yeah, Absolutely. I get these little insights into people's lives and that's always beautiful, right? It's always beautiful
Mm,
to have someone take your horizons and go,
yeah.
they're a little bit broader.
I mean, that just goes to support the idea that like we're more suited to storytelling than factor gathering, right? Um, so with this academic work, then like, is it, let's say a mathematician like contacted you and they do algebra. I don't know how I don't know a fancy algebra name like vector calculus or something. Like, is that, would you feel limited there? Like, is it like, are there certain fields where you're like okay, but then there are certain fields where you just couldn't tell the story?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are certain fields where it's more obvious. There are
Mm.
certain fields where it's more obvious. I'll give you that. I was on a project. I mean, this is years and years ago, and it was at a conference or sort of gathering. And the first thing that all of the different researchers there had to do was they had to do a poster presentation about themselves, their life, and their work. And there was one woman there who was a mathematician. I forget her name now. It was years ago. And like she had this poster, and like the left half was her family and her pets, and the right half was her work. And so she's talking, and she's talking about her family, and she's talking about her dogs, and she's talking, and then she kind of turns and she just sort of gestures at the research half, the maths, and there's a bit of a pause, and then she turns back to, the family, and she goes back to talking about that. And over dinner, she did sort of round on me, and she said, "Tim, you don't understand. Like, um, I can talk about like how some of the maths I do might be used in Google search algorithms, for example, but what I do is like a black box that people can't see inside. They can see what goes in, they can see what comes out, but I can't make them understand that." So, firstly, turns out she could talk about what she did, but she had to get a bit metaphorical about it.
Okay.
And secondly, I think we can be a bit hamstrung around this idea of what it means to understand something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
like, unless you're teaching someone to do the maths, they don't necessarily need to understand all of the rules for how the letters move across the page.
Yeah.
But if they get a sense of, what it might mean, what its implications are in the world, or even just what it is about it that excites you, the person
Mm.
that's doing it, they're going to come away feeling a sense of connection, a sense of understanding on a level that is not above, but is definitely different to like actually having understood the maths or the
That
underlying
makes
principles.
sense. There's
Yeah.
this have you heard of chaos theory?
Yeah.
There's this book called Chaos by an author called James Gleick, right? So I wanted to sort of dip my toes into chaos theory. I'm not a mathematician, so that's quite a leap to say the least. But this book
Mhm.
was recommended to me because it basically tells the story of chaos theory, right? And it goes through the history and all the notable figures and how they came to their conclusions, right? But it's not telling me the derivations. No one wants to know that. And
Yeah.
like you can't pick up chaos theory like in a book. It takes like years of mathematical practice, right? So yeah, I definitely get what you're saying. Which like it, I don't. I think it comes to like an understanding of the mathematics, right? Like chaos theory on first glance might not be applicable at all. What the hell, right? Then you understand it and you see it everywhere, right? And then maybe it's the same with these mathematicians, but they get stuck in their sort of their numbers and their data crunching.
There's a great scene in Good Will Hunting. There's a scene in
Wow.
Good Will Hunting where Matt Damon he's done some maths. He's done some maths, and he takes it to his professor, and his professor is looking at it going, "Well, I'm not sure at this." And Matt Damon's like, "No, it's right. It's just trust me,
Mm.
it's right." He goes, "No, but have you thought of?" And in the end, Matt Damon gets frustrated and he picks up the maths and he throws it into the fire. And like the professor's diving in, he's trying to get it out of the fire. He doesn't want to lose this incredible maths that's been done. And he sort of says, "Oh, you're right. You're right. You're better than me at this. And there's maybe only half a dozen people in the world that understand that." And what I love about that moment in that film is the the lie of it, because there's tens, hundreds of thousands of people in cinemas around the world eating their popcorn, caring about that maths, right? Like, so it means something to them without them needing to like know what's going on with the formulas at all.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's cool. That's a good way of looking at it. So, when it comes to like communicating a story, I touched upon this earlier, but you got this problem of, I say problem, but so subjectivity is built into the process.
Yeah.
Right? Now, to what degree is like ambiguity a sign of a good story? Because like to be ambiguous means sort of you could communicate like either like you could say you're communicating nothing, but that's not ambiguous, it's useless, right? Or you have the potential to be understood in a number of different ways, right? But that you could be infinitely ambiguous then and just be potentially understood in like a million, well, infinite different ways, right? Because everyone's different. So like, but then the story stops being useful if it was infinitely ambiguous. So to what degree is ambiguity useful in a story?
Yeah. Oh, you get some deep questions here, don't you? I think there's a lot of things that we could say to that. I think for stories to work well, people have to be able to do a bit of the work themselves, a bit of the interpretation themselves.
Yeah.
It's what keeps them awake to the story.
What makes the philosophy meaningful to them, because they go through the journey with you.
We can talk a little bit about that in a moment. So you leave a little bit of space. I think as a storyteller, though, sometimes it's helpful for you to know like what you mean, or sometimes it can be. So there's a great storyteller called Abby Patrick, storyteller in the kind of spoken word oral tradition, and he has a thing which, when he's talking about like how much do you visualize, how much do you imagine when you are telling a story, he says, I can see everything and then I have to choose what to say, right? So when he's talking about, I don't know, a hero battling a monster from a myth, like it's all happening there in front of him. The grains of sand being thrown up by the hero's sandals or whatever. Yeah. And then he chooses based on the pace, the emotion, what he's trying to get across, which of those details he puts across. And I think where ambiguity is powerful, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I kind of feel like if the essence or the truth of a story is too obvious, it can feel a little bit preachy. Yeah. So if someone says something and it's like, and clearly the moral of this story is this, it's like, well, okay. Yeah. I like it sometimes when there's a bit of space at the end, maybe for a bit of discussion or wondering, like, what does it really mean? How, and then you can talk about the story, and that's always good.
And that's the power of it, right? I suppose like in the moment you're experiencing it, it's like watching a movie in a sense, right? But then, the power of it, like in terms of like communicating whatever it set out to communicate, assuming it set out to communicate anything, is in the discussion or the thought after, right? It's just like plant an idea, almost like Inception.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like planting a seed, but you don't quite know what seed it is you've planted. You can,
because like, so when I was a kid, in India, we have to have like these storybooks, right, or like short Indian stories, right, and then some of these books, at the end, it'd be like the moral of the story was this, right? So then I went through a phase of thinking, well, do all these authors write stories with the intent of like communicating this moral? But that's a bit wooden, right? Like maybe it's more sort of, or the author's in this sort of psychological state. So then when they're writing this story, right, this like because you're living in a moral world, you're making moral decisions, right? Then if you're sort of communicating yourself in the story, you might be communicating your moral dilemmas, right? Maybe if you're a very, very masterful storyteller and you've got this like this deep understanding of morality, maybe and a deep understanding of storytelling, you could set out to communicate a moral, right? What do you think? Like, I don't know, because you studying these like ancient stories, right? So, like, what do you think is more likely in those scenarios?
Yeah, and it's lovely that you mentioned growing up in India. I, I I went over to India to do some storytelling work. I mean, this is a few years ago now. And one of the most interesting differences, if I tell stories in the UK, and then at the end there's like, oh, do you want to question and answers with the storyteller? Like the most common question is usually like, oh, how do you remember all of that?
Mm.
And it's like, it's quite a hard question to answer because the thing is like the real answer is like actually stories are the easiest thing for human beings to do. Stories and
Yeah.
space are the things that we are good at remembering as human beings. um, but in India, like nobody asked about memory. It was like, yeah, sure, you've told stories for an hour. What? If you've memorized the entire Ramayana, I'm not interested. You do not impress me as a
That
person.
doesn't surprise me at all, to be fair.
But over there, everyone wanted to ask about, but what was the moral of that story?
Oh,
Like it was
really?
the number one topic of conversation. And I don't know, like this is always a slight culture. I don't know if what they were asking for was like, tell me the exact and specific end of the story. What is the moral? Or um, if they're saying, well, let's have a talk about it. You tell me what you think it was, and then I'll tell you what I think it was, and then I'll go home with my family, and we'll all have a chat in the car about.
Yeah.
And I think stories are, and this is why I mentioned the emotions earlier on, because almost for me, like they teach us our values more than they teach us the specifics of what is right and wrong, right? So what I mean by that is that, um, a story might say, don't steal, right? Maybe that's a very simple moral. Oh, in this story, someone stole something and someone else was sad. The moral of the story is don't steal. But maybe what the story is doing better is it's teaching us to think about how we are connected to other people. It's teaching us this value of understanding the implications of our actions. It's teaching us to maybe behave respectfully, like we should be respectful or honorable. And that's I think slightly different than just a yes or no. This is the way. This isn't the way. Yeah, I can try and formulate that thought a little bit more clearly if that wasn't
No, I
perfect.
get that. Because so that we were talking last week about this. Um, like when I was reading these storybooks in India, there was one story, the story of Holi. Um, so I'll tell it quickly. So Vishnu is one of the three main Indian gods. I'm really oversimplifying the Indian pantheon, the Hindu pantheon. And he incarnates himself into like 10 forms over the course of existence to what's the word? Protect dharma, right? And dharma is this fundamental value guiding Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism. You could argue they're all the same, but that's another time. And so in this story, what happens is there's this demonic king, right? And this demonic king has this power that he was given from another god, right? And he said to this god, I never want to be killed in the night or the day by an animal or a human, inside or outside, and a few other like X or Y like things, A or B things, right? Like dual choices. So everyone's like, oh my God, I can't kill this guy. Like, how powerful, right? How do you kill someone who's neither like inside or outside? There's no, like, you're either inside or you're outside, which, you're led to believe. And well, eventually he gets angry at his son, right? The king's got a son, and the son is praying to Vishnu, and he's like, why are you praying to Vishnu? I'm more powerful than Vishnu. Like, pray to me. Son refuses to, eventually tries to kill his son, and then Vishnu comes down, right? And he's incarnated in this sort of half lion, half human form, and he kills the king, like in the courtyard, which is like sort of inside and outside. And yeah, so he satisfies the middle ground, right? And then so when I was a kid, that was a cool story, right? And then when I was a kid, the book said yeah, the moral of this story is that God is cool, pray to God, don't pray to other people. That's on the surface level. But then I looked at this story the other day on Wikipedia of all places, right? Which isn't the most it's not known for its storytelling prowess. And I came to this idea that duality is a falsehood. And that really speaks to your point about how stories tell values, right? So now I have this idea that duality is a falsehood. So whenever you see a duality, look for the mid ground.
Yeah, I'll look for something outside the box. I love that, and I love that. I like the story, and I first came across that story. I was in Leicester with some of our mutual friends, like Chandrakant was there, Sachin Nanda was there, and it was for Holi, and what a great British Indian thing, because it was snowing, so it was like coloured snowballs. But they got some kids acted out that story, and it was the first time I'd heard that story. But that motif of the character who, can only be killed. There's a Welsh version in the Mabinogion where it's like they can't be killed on land or on water, inside or outside, clothed or unclothed. And it's like, well, they're killed stepping out of a bath under a lean-to shelter with just a net wrapped around them or something. Yeah. It's a less, I think it's, yeah, actually I won't make that comparison just now, but what a brilliant example of how you had that story with you when you were a kid, and maybe it had one meaning, and then as you got older and encountered it again, you were able to find different meanings in it, different meanings, deeper meanings so the story changed with you. And it's, we were talking about this last week. Sometimes I feel like the way that we engage with stories now is very disposable. Everyone's really concerned about spoilers because we just want that experience of seeing the episode on TV, watching the film for the first time. Oh, that's great. And then boom, it's done, it's over. We go on to the next thing. And maybe it's only a few of our favorite films, even fewer of our favorite books that we get down off the shelf or we put on again. And I don't want to criticize that too much, because we all need to be entertained, but what a different way of engaging with material if we live with those stories over and over. And those stories that have been with us in our families, in our culture, whatever, for ages, so they have a sense like these are the really important ones, and they've been honed, and they will change to reflect what's going on. Hopefully they'll change to reflect what we need from them over time, and we have a chance to find different things.
That's what's incredible about them, because they maintain they're very robust in their sort of identity, right? Because we go through these changes, and we change with the stories, but the story is still the story, right? And again, in a sense, it was again we come back to the ambiguity thing, because the ambiguity in this story is limited, right? Because when I was a kid, there was that interpretation. When now I have this interpretation, right? But I couldn't interpret that, I don't know, killing people on pillars is the best thing. That's not a valid interpretation.
Yeah.
But you could argue it. But again, it comes. I don't know if this is a fair question to ask, but do you think the author wrote the story with the intent that we find these different values?
Yeah, I mean, I think authorial intent is a really interesting question. And even when it's not authorial, even when it's me doing an adaptation, right? There might be some intent in the adaptation. And maybe that lands or it doesn't, and maybe that's okay. And some people might take something crazy that you'd never have expected them to take away from the story. They might just see something in that moment in the story that you didn't mean, that the whole, oh yeah, killing people on pillars is the big, whoa, okay, what? You can't control what people take away from your stories always. But there are some interpretations that are a bit more supported by the
Mm.
story, and it's worth, yeah, it's important on us as storytellers to think about what they might mean, and what meanings we might be putting out into the world.
So when you're researching stories, then like, what's the process? Because I imagine a large part of it is looking for new stories. But then, is there also, like, let's say you have this story that you've been telling for years. Is there I need to do more research into the author to understand this story more?
Yeah, I think there's two starting points. I'll start with the starting points. There's two starting points. I might find a story and think, this story is amazing. I need to create an opportunity to tell it. And for me, like, the story only really comes alive like in the telling for the first time, which is why I practice with my wife quite a lot. Bless her.
Okay.
She puts up with it. You know, those first few mumble through, say it out loud. That's when I get the sense of, like, this is where it's weak. This is where the gaps are. This is what doesn't make sense. This is what does make sense in the story for me. And then, then can develop, maybe build it into a show, whatever, work out where I can tell it. The other starting point might be, I get a phone call. Oh, hi, what's that? Oh, you're doing a sleepover at the British Museum and you want stories about ancient Egypt. Yeah, I've got loads of stories about ancient Egypt. Click, not like any phone goes click anymore, but click. And then it's like, hop on, as you say, Wikipedia or something.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I need to do the research now, or I get the books out. And it's like, what is there? So you find the stories to fit the brief or the project.
Mm.
But with both of those, there is then that sense of, like, okay, how often do we go back to these stories and for what reasons? I took a show to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2014. And it was like 26 nights on the trot. I was doing the same hour long show every night, boom, 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 and it was the free Fringe as well. So like the audience, it was not like the audience were committed. They just come in on a whim to see what it was going to be like. And it was in the basement of a slightly kind of grimy rock bar. Like they were some tough crowds. It was some tough crowds.
Yeah.
And in order to keep like my passion alive, one of the deals I made with myself was that every night I was going to notice something different in the story or about the story. And even if it didn't change my words, I might see what the characters were wearing differently. And it was always with the spirit of discovery.
Mm.
It was always, every time I'd go start telling the show, I'd start telling the stories, and they'd be like, okay, what is there here for me to notice this time that I've never noticed before in this story, in this language, perhaps, even, like, if it did come into what I say, are there patterns, are there rhymes, are there kind of, some funky kind of formulae in the words, in the patter to notice. And some of that maybe didn't get, like, if I just noticed, that this person's mother is dressed differently tonight, or is, there's different flowers growing in the garden, I might not say anything about that to the audience, but it meant that I met the story alive each time, which, if you're doing it 26 nights in a row, you don't want to be bored, because if you're bored, they're going to be bored.
Everyone's bored, yeah.
Everyone's bored. So but I'll give another example about how the meaning of a story might change. So I was in Northampton telling Viking stories, and one of the stories is about the death of Balder. And I'm telling it from the point of view of a totally different character, not really involved with that story, but it's going on in the background. Balder dies. Balder is so beautiful and so loved by almost everyone that Balder's mother, Queen of the Gods, goes down into the lands of the dead and begs, please, that the Queen of the Dead give Balder her son back to life. And because Balder is so loved, the Queen of the Dead makes an exception that will never be made again and says, all right, I'll give you a chance. If every living thing cries for Balder at the same time, then he can come back. The contract of death will be broken. He will be returned to life. And so the Queen of the Gods then has to travel all over, like the mortal realms, speaking to every plant, every flower, whatever, about the death of her son and explaining things and asking if they will weep. and I'm telling the story from the point of view of this giantess. She's involved in her, she's got her own stuff going on, but the Queen of the Gods talks to her about it. And so at the appointed hour, she goes up into her father's hall and she stands there and she starts crying, and she looks around and like the plants are weeping the dew in the morning. The clouds are crying down the rain. The stars are blurring themselves as they cry up in the skies. She's crying. And then the sun rises the next morning and she can just tell that Balder has not come back to life because someone somewhere hasn't cried. And, I was chatting to you about this last week, and it's the trickster god, right? It's Loki who has disguised himself and hasn't cried, and he's spoiled the whole thing. So I tell this story, right? And it's a cool story. And then I move on to the rest of the show. And a few months later, I was back in Northampton with some different stories, totally different context. And someone came up to me afterwards, and they really wanted to speak to me. They kind of grabbed me, and I said, "Oh, great! I saw your show, the Viking show." And I said, "Oh, that was good. I'm glad you came back to see different ones." He was like, "Yeah. Didn't want to talk about that though." In between then and now, my dad has died. I'm like, "Oh gosh, I'm sorry. My condolences." Yeah, that's not what he wanted to talk about after. He wanted to talk about how after the funeral, he was driving home, and there was a bit where it started raining, and he stopped and he parked the car and he got out, and just standing there in the rain, it was like the whole world was crying. And he said, yes, it said it was like the whole world was crying, and that makes sense because everyone loved Dad.
Wow.
So powerful, right? And we were talking earlier on about stories giving us a space to feel feelings and to make sense of and understand our feelings. And like, I'm so honored that he found in that story something that just gave him an insight into grief and kind of the inescapable inevitability of grief, and the way that when we're in grief, we are connected to, like, or we can be connected to, like, they're big feelings, connected to the world around us, the world beyond us. But also that's the gift for him. The gift for me is that every time I tell that story now in the future, even like I'm telling it to you now, like I feel a little bit of what I felt when I had that experience with him. Yeah, and that adds more to my feeling. So hopefully that means that more gets conveyed in the story, in the telling, in the future.
That's incredible. They're there's an amazing amount of like depth there, because it's sort of self-discovery. Like, you telling the story is discovering yourself in a way, right? Like, especially when you said it when you were telling the stories at the Fringe Festival, right? Because when you see new things, you're essentially just rediscovering your mind at the time. But then there's the depth of like people interpreting it. Like, I suppose then this comes back to the whole ambiguity thing, because like it doesn't matter then, like, to an extent, right? How, like, what exactly other people see from it, because you didn't intend for him to have like feel consolation in that story when his father died. You didn't intend for that, but he did.
Yeah, so, and interesting. And he didn't feel that. It's not like at the time when he was listening, he felt that. It was later on, like later on, a month later, when he needed it, that story was there for him to kind of like lean back on, or whatever language you want to use. Then, then it made sense.
And that's very, like, we could like break down the story and say the philosophy of it, and you could have done that at the time. And then he probably wouldn't have had that to lean back on. Yeah, that's crazy. Wow. So you've told a story from Norse mythology, right? But then at the beginning, you said sort of you grew up in the sort of like British tradition of stories, right? Now, I'm not going to discount this, but like people, when they talk about Britain now, they talk about colonialism, right? And me being British Indian, I know full well the horrors of colonialism. So let's not talk about that. But then everyone forgets like that Britain had a culture before. Can you just sort of give me the quick ABCs of the culture of the stories?
Yeah, I mean, really, I think really good question, because, you know, for me as a sort of lower middle class white English person, there is a sort of sense of being orphaned to tradition, like having lost our tradition. And I'll sort of counter that by saying that when I was young. This is when I was younger at one of these festivals where I saw storytellers. There was like a panel with I can't remember, Dovey Thomason, who's a Native American storyteller, was one of the people on that panel, and there were a few others as well. And one of the people kind of in the audience asked this question. She was saying, "Oh, in England, we don't really have a culture. Your cultures are so rich, and so we don't really have a culture." And like, I wish I could remember her name, but the woman from China there, she sort of said, "Oh, hang on a moment. Do you lay your table for a meal?" And the woman was like, "Yeah, I set the table." Said, "Yeah, good. We don't. In my household, we have one pot and it's cooking all the time. And when it's their turn, they come and they eat and they take it away, and maybe they eat with. So when I come here, I see the plate laid for me. It's been prepared for me. That says something. I know if there is a spoon at the top, that means save some room. There's going to be pudding at the end. You have culture, but you don't realize it." So I include that just to acknowledge that when I say we're somewhat orphans to tradition, we can take that idea too far, and we can romanticize, you know, and exotify the other, which maybe ends up reproducing some of those colonial patterns that we're not going to talk about. So what has happened, I think, in this country is that during, I guess, an awful lot of the relocation that happens from the agricultural areas to in the kind of industrial revolution, and then because of the sort of mass medias that have come along, whether that's kind of music hall or TV, we have not got as much of a sense of, you know, the stories that are passed down from one person to another, which is why, you know, folklorists a century and more ago suddenly went, "Oh, we better write down all the stories of the common folk and put them all in a nice book, so they don't get lost," which is important work. Though those books always have the name of the folklorist on them, not the names of the people that the stories were collected
Yeah,
from.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So in this country, we've got perhaps like old stories that maybe have a Celtic flavor, but a lot of those weren't written down until later, or if they were written down, they were written down by Christian monks. In Wales, you get the Mabinogion, and for example, and it's the Christian monks that are writing them down. And there's this interesting thing that happens, because when you write something down, it gets fixed. So it almost feels like when something gets written down, it gets preserved. But also that the people that are doing the writing down always have an agenda. So yeah, it gets fixed, but also it probably got shifted quite a lot in order to get rooted. And there are tradition bearers in this country today, perhaps in the Scottish traveling communities, for example, or, you know, there are Jewish storytellers who I know that work in family traditions. But for someone like me, it's not like I grew up thinking, "Oh yes, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, those are my stories," right? That's just not the kind of stories that were being told in my household by my family growing up. In fact, we didn't really tell very many stories, and I might come more to that in a bit later. So in the 1980s in the UK, this is a slight simplification, but only a slight one. In the 1980s, there were people who were really into storytelling, who were looking around the world and going, "Look, you've got, you know, the griots and the ashiks. You've got all of these great storytelling traditions around the world. Why aren't there people doing storytelling work in the UK?" And they kind of created it, and they did a lot of work to get it, you know, recognized, and to then take it into schools and libraries and theatre spaces, festival spaces. But they sort of did it in a somewhat eclectic way. So they might say, oh, great, here are some great wisdom stories from the Sufis. Here are some lovely bits of Indian mythology. Here are some Viking stories. Here are some Irish fairy tales. And there's questions of cultural appropriation here, but the sort of the storytelling world in which I grew up was one in which most British storytellers were had a slightly magpie approach, right? They had a slightly magpie approach. And there's good and there's bad with that. There's good and there's bad with that. The good is that you get to experience stories from all over. There is a value, I think, in stories being tied to a place. Like, there is a value. Tied is maybe the wrong word, but stories feeling rooted in. Let's say rooted is a better word. So, if in those Welsh myths, you remember I was talking about that guy who gets killed stepping out of a bath.
Yes.
He's killed. His name is Llw, or Llw. I can't quite pronounce the Welsh.
Okay.
And he's killed by his wife's lover, right? His wife, Blodeuwedd, woman made of flowers. We could tell that whole story. Eventually, he comes back to life. He's found and he's nurtured back to life. We're not going to get into that. He hunts down the guy who killed him, the guy who conspired with his wife's lover, to set up this whole trap and to solve the riddle and kill him. And he says, oh, you hit me with a spear once. I get to hit you with a spear once. And the guy's like, oh, okay, but can I have like some protection? You're so strong. Give me a boulder. So he gets a big stone and he hides behind it. And he throws the spear. It goes straight through the boulder. It hits the guy and it kills him. That stone is still in Wales.
No.
With the hole through it. Whether that story happened or not is almost not important.
Yeah.
What's important is that people can point at it and can say, that's where it happened. This is where the spear got thrown.
And there's that connection with the land almost.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There was a BBC clip that was going around a while back. Maybe you remember it. But it was this lake in Wales that was getting renamed. And its Welsh name was signifying this entire story behind it, because I don't know if it was shaped like a horse or an elephant or something. It was just shaped like something. But the Welsh name basically had the story in it. But then they were renaming it to something easy, like, I don't know, Lake of the Eight or something. And I suppose that's a result of maybe that's a result of disconnection from the stories, or disconnection from the land, or maybe both, right?
I didn't see the clip, but it sounds really interesting. And
I'll drop a link in the description or something, and I'll send it to you later. But yes, it's BBC sometimes get it really right. Yeah,
it's worth every penny. I think you can go to other subscriptions, but but there is something about that. Like, if you forget the stories, then we lose a little bit of our connection to that place.
Well, that's why having a canon of stories is useful, right? Because for example, if you can draw from the Welsh canon of stories, you're connected to the an entire swathe of thought around the land.
Mm-hmm. And the land will remind you of the stories. So, I mean, this is one of the fascinating things. If you look at the Australian Aboriginals, those stories are all tied to let's not pretend that it was one in people with one only way of being, but a lot of those stories have the song lines, so that if you're on your annual migration, it's like your feet tell the story to you as you're walking.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So how are you going to forget that story? And also then, how painful is it if someone turfs you off your land or buys it up or renames the lake, right? Because it's hitting you threefold when those things happen.
That's a good way of putting it. I suppose that because when you were talking, I'm not going to talk about cultural appropriation. But when you talk about having this magpie effect of this story is cool, this story is cool. I suppose that's why you sort of lose the magic a little bit. because
Yeah, we
like
do.
you draw one story from the Indian tradition, that's great, but like without knowledge of the rest of the canon, right? Then you lose a bit of that emotion, right? You lose the effect of the story, you lose the core, like the like, the causes of the story.
Yeah, yeah, and the detail, and you're always gonna or the risk is that you interpret it so much through your cultural lens that there's something of the soul of that story gets lost along the
Yeah,
way.
that's a good point.
Um, you know, I mean, I still do tell, like I
Mm.
still do tell Indian myths every now and then, and I hope that I do enough of my work and have enough of, yeah, it's like it's a balancing act, right? Like something will be lost. Hopefully, there's enough virtue that overall those
Well,
scales.
I mean, yeah, but then because you come from a very unique perspective, right? Because if I'd only ever lived in one culture, right, and then I started telling Japanese stories, right, that's a bit different. Like you come from this sort of interfaith tradition, and you've like been present at events like connecting sort of like Hindus and Druids together. I'll put links in the bio, in the description. But then that's okay though, because now you're talking about it from the point of view sort of like universal knowledge, right? And then you're coming at it with a respect for the culture that it comes from.
Hmm. Do you want to talk a little bit for people who don't know us in that aspect of us, how it is that we met
Yeah,
and
sure.
how
Yeah.
we know each other?
So Tim and I met at an event called One Tree Gathering, right? So One Tree Gathering is a event where Druids and Hindus like meet together, and it's a weekend long sort of conference about the commonalities between Druidry and Hinduism. Right now, I joined this event in 2015, and I think I met you in like 2016, 2017,
Something like
around
that.
that kind. Yeah, around that kind of time. So yeah, so we already connected over this quite obvious commonality, right? Obvious if you're there. And yeah, so OTG is a part of like an organization called the International Center for Cultural Studies, ICCS, which is predicated on drawing wisdom from ancient traditions, right? Ancient traditions like the Aztecs and Hindus, they're ancient, Druids are ancient, pagan traditions all across the world, right? So the perspective that somebody's coming from being sort of a part of that or attending those kind of events is very different to the perspective that someone who's been isolated is coming from, right? So I'd probably argue that it's basically impossible for you to culturally appropriate a Hindu story.
Okay, you can make that argument.
I
I'm not
mean,
going to make that argument.
that's fine. I'm happy enough to say it because that you that there's a demonstrated respect for the Hindu culture. There's a demonstrated respect for the traditions that you're talking about and the philosophies that you're talking about, right? Cultural appropriation would be sort of like a superficial, like lapping up of the soul. Oh yeah, this is cool, and it's talking, and then you sort of like a superficial like bolting on of the philosophies that you know from like Druidry and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's like if I tell a story from Indian myth to say I go into a school, right? And maybe it's not a school with a lot of British Indian children in it, and I tell something of Indian mythology, that might be a bit of an insight, right? That
Mm.
might be a chance for, a load of rural English kids to get sense of something a bit broader or outside. So there's a good to it, and sometimes it's really useful to have that slightly safe space of a distant culture or even just the mythological world. I can remember when I was in Delhi. I was in Delhi telling stories at a festival, and during the day, it was a big outdoor venue. And during the day, they'd bus in kids from schools, and the kids would sit, hundreds of kids would sit and would listen to us telling stories. And there were some incredible puppeteers from Rajasthan, like these Rajasthani
Okay.
puppeteers. It was amazing. And we were telling stories as well. And then in the evening, it was sort of open to adults as well. They would come and they'd fill the light. It was underneath a great big peepal tree. the light would go down except for the glow of the city around us, and we would tell stories. Amazing festival. And I can remember someone told a story, an Arthurian myth. One of the other storytellers told an Arthurian myth, and I wasn't going to tell an Arthurian story, King Arthur. We know the King Arthur character, but I thought, that other storyteller has just done all the work of introducing this Indian audience to the characters. So maybe I'll tell another story in that tradition, and it will be, it'll be easier. So I start telling, and I hadn't thought through everything that happened in this story when I started telling it, because the story I start telling is the story of Sir Gawain, who is one of King Arthur's nephews, and the Green Knight. Very old story. It exists as poems and as prose. I say very old. Just take a moment. Very old because I'm British, so a story that was written down 700 years ago is very old, right? Like obviously in India, that's not a very old story. But we'll just put that to one side for a moment. And the basic crux of the story is that a green knight, mysterious figure, clothed all in green, rides into the court one winter and challenges the knights to a kind of contest of strength and bravery, where one of them has to chop off his head with an axe, and then in a year's time they have to go and visit the knight, the Green Knight, and the knight will chop off their head. Do they have the audacity to believe in the challenge to begin with, and then do they have the courage to go through with what they signed up for and actually go and meet this fate? So lovely story. But there's a scene in it where Gawain is staying, because a lot of it's the journey from Arthur's court to the court of the Green Knight. Gawain, our hero, is staying with a particular lord, and they've made a deal. The lord will go out hunting during the day. What he wins hunting, he will give to Gawain, and what Gawain gets from staying at home and studying and praying, he will give to the lord. And what has happened is the lord has gone out and killed, let's say it's the first day, he's killed a great stag or something, and so he's bringing back the antlers, and middle of winter, it'd probably be quite small antlers, depending on the time of year. What has happened with Gawain is that Gawain and the lord's wife, the lady of the castle, are sort of, they're flirting, right? Something a little bit inappropriate is on the cards between the two of them. And all that has happened is that they have kissed, because Gawain is trying to stick to his code of chastity and honor and respect and not have anything going on with someone else's wife, but they have kissed. So in the scene where the lord comes in and he's throwing down the antlers and the skins of the hunt, he's like, "What did you win?" And Gawain steps forward, and these two, now I've told this story in the UK, and sometimes that moment gets a bit of a laugh. It's funny, this big beardy lord and this fine noble knight have a bit of a snog by the fire, and sometimes it maybe has a romance to it, and often it hasn't quite, I've not quite been sure what the energy is. And in Delhi, and what I don't know is that day, I don't even understand the history of this at that time. That day, this was some time ago, is the day when the High Court were looking into the criminalization of homosexuality.
Oh.
And so I'm telling this story, and I haven't even thought through, and this scene happens where these two men go to kiss, and it's not like a particularly sexy kiss, right? But these two men go to kiss each other, and I swear, everyone in the amphitheater, like we all go, and then they just kiss, and it's fine. The world doesn't end, and we breathe out, and we go on together on the journey. Now, I think the fact that that story is from another time, another tradition, it's exotic for the Indian people in the audience. It's an exotic story. It's from over there. I think that makes it a little bit safer for it to happen. Like, I wish I could say I was clever enough to set it up. I wasn't. It was a happy accident. but I'm really happy that it happened, because if that was a story that I'd written, if I would have been an Indian storyteller telling an Indian story, I think it would have been an even more controversial moment where actually it was just, it happened
Mm.
and we all got to move on,
Mm.
you know, and it wasn't, nothing was unleashed. Thunder did not strike. So yeah, there was a depth to it. I don't know if that's quite making sense what I'm saying, but it's like that safe space.
Yeah, that distance.
Yeah, that distance.
That's interesting.
Mm.
So one of the other things you mentioned to me then, right? So we're talking about stories in other cultures, but then you mentioned like stories within the family.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I was saying that I mean, I'm really glad. Like, and I got read to as a child, and like, I think if my stepdad did the voices every evening when he'd read to me, and I loved that. But we didn't tell family stories, and I think this really only kind of got driven home to me. Like, we didn't tell stories, particularly cultural stories. We read stories out of books, or what have we got from the library this week? Oh, it's another Roald Dahl. We'll read that. Great stories, but they weren't they weren't the same stories that my parents had grown up with, for example. So there wasn't a
So
sense of,
you mean like family stories that have been like passed down the
yeah, and
generation? Okay.
it was both. We didn't get kind of like stories passed down to the generation, but also it's not like I didn't hear the stories of how my parents met. I didn't hear
Okay.
the stories about what it was like for them to grow up, you know. And this was really driven home to me when I met my wife, and because within a few years of getting together with my wife, I'll use this as an example of what it was like from her telling stories about her family and growing up in a family story kind of environment. I could tell you more about the house that she grew up in and the history of the house that she grew up in than I could tell you about my grandfather. And like, that doesn't seem right, does it? Like,
Wow.
there's something slightly wrong. And I'd lost my grandfather at that time, and I was like, gosh, have I lost a little bit of who I am because I don't have those stories? So I went and I spoke to my grandma about it, and I started deliberately like, okay, ours is not a household. We'll talk about what happened during the day. We got very good at making polite conversation. We were trained in it around the dinner table every evening, kind of informal.
Every British person is.
Yeah, I mean, and look, I respect that, right? Because I'm one of four, which is, it's by modern standards, that's quite a big family, like four siblings, two parents, six people around the dinner table. And so the fact that we kind of like had a very structured, we're going to take it in turns to say what is the most interesting thing that happened to us today, like was probably good for me learning things like manners and listening and so forth. So I don't criticize that, but I didn't have that sense of who are my parents, who are my grandparents, what was their life like that. So to then deliberately go and like, just at Christmas when my grandma was there, sit next to her and go, hey, how did you and granddad meet each other? And that was a great story, because basically what came out was that she had a lot of soldiers that she was seeing during the Second World War, and she hadn't meant to add another one to the roster, but her friend needed someone to go on a double date, and so it had just happened. And like, the best thing about this is my little tiny grandmother's telling this story, and at the end, when she's kind of, I guess, realized what she said about what it was like, she sort of looked at me and went, Tim, you have to understand it was a very different time back then.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Beautiful. And like, what a gift for me to have this insight into something's happening with my, don't update things, sorry, that's me. What a gift for me to have this insight into her as a human being, like as a fuller, more rounded human being. Like, yeah, so I really value that, but it was something that I had to sort of start doing deliberately. And then some of the stories come out that make you think, oh, okay, I understand why there are things that we kept secret. Maybe I don't agree that we didn't talk about those things, but I can sort of see why, like there were sadnesses, bereavements, upsets in my family history. So, yeah.
That's really interesting, because it, like, if you want to communicate things of value, it's sort of then your responsibility to tell the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
To whatever capacity you can. Like, I wouldn't say I'm the world's best storyteller, right? I wouldn't say I'm a good storyteller. But if I wanted to communicate something of worth, I wouldn't be like, this is the thing of worth. I have to tell the story around it, and I'm responsible to tell the story around it, right? If I had a kid, I wanted the kid to understand something, I should tell the story, right? If it's like, it seems less of a luxury at that point, and more of a responsibility, right? And then take stories out of the realm of entertainment and more towards the sort of the bedrock of culture.
Yeah. Because stories will be the bedrock of our culture, and you can have those stories be, stories of the family that loved you or that you came from, and you can maybe understand a little bit about what the people that you grew up with are like and why they're like that if you hear those stories. Or it can be the cartoons that you watch when you get home from school, which is and which of those is going to be more nourishing? That's the question. Which of those is going to be more nourishing and give you a better sense of who you are as a human being?
So then, let's say his final thoughts for anyone who literally just tuned into the end of the podcast, just skip to the end. What would you want them to leave thinking?
What would I want them to leave thinking? Oh, you put me on the spot there. I would love them to notice stories as they were happening. I'd love them to kind of go, oh wait, this is a story that I'm telling. When I'm telling to someone about my day, this is a story that I'm telling. I'd love them to notice when they're hearing stories, and I'd love them to sort of think a little bit about, like, well, what makes it a good story? Like, is there a way of speaking? Are there words that I can use that would make this story more rich, more tantalizing, more memorable? I'd love for people to, and as you were talking about that great story of Vishnu, I'd love for people to maybe think back over the stories they grew up with and say, oh, what is there more meaning in these for me now to discover? Whatever they were, right? Whatever they were. Is there more meaning in them for me to discover? How have they helped make me the person that I am? How have they contributed to the person that I am? And then that's enough. Maybe that's enough of my wishes for now. What would you like for our listeners?
I would say that the arts, and you can 150% see it in storytelling, are very valuable examples to understand. Like, they are the mythos, but through the mythos we can understand the logos, right? Through this, the stories are the reason they're so powerful, are because they communicate to very deep sort of biological truths, and that gives you a true understanding, right? I wouldn't say true understanding. That gives you a stepping stone to really understand the power of stories.
Yeah.
Well said. There we go. I think that's a good place to sign off on.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Tim. That was an absolute pleasure. Like, one thing about these podcasts is, like, I get to learn a lot, and I hope everybody else gets to learn a lot too. Just exuding knowledge through your stories.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a privilege. It's been a privilege, man. It always is.